My father is a billionaire, a name known in boardrooms and on magazine covers. But I've always felt that living under his shadow came with its own set of chains. From the time I was old enough to understand the value of money, I knew I didn't want to be the guy who coasted through life on a golden parachute, handed every opportunity without ever earning it. It wasn't about rebellion or pride. It was about proving to myself that I could stand on my own 2 feet. People often talk about privilege as if it's a shortcut, but for me it always felt like a weight I had to shake off. I didn't want to be the guy everyone whispered about in college hallways or office break rooms. Oh, he's only here because of his dad. I wanted to carve out my own identity. So, while my friends were discussing internships that required strings to be pulled, I took a different route. After finishing college, I landed an entry-level job at a logistics company. Nothing fancy, just a lot of spreadsheets, warehouse visits, and early mornings. I rented a small, 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood where the walls were thin, and the pipes clanked whenever someone took a shower. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every cent of rent, every piece of furniture, every bag of groceries. I paid for it all myself. No one at work knew about my background, and I intended to keep it that way. The only clue to my upbringing might have been my polished manners and decent wardrobe, but even that was muted, just enough to blend in. I drove an old sedan, the kind that rattled slightly when it idled, but it got me where I needed to go. My coworkers joked about its personality, but I didn't mind. It was a badge of honor, proof that I wasn't leaning on my family's wealth. Life wasn't easy, but it was honest. I took pride in my choices, even when they meant skipping out on things I couldn't afford. Lavish vacations? Out of the question. Fancy dinners? Maybe once a month, and only if I budgeted carefully. But I liked it that way. Each small victory felt earned, not handed down. When I met Emily, I thought I'd found someone who understood that kind of simplicity. We clicked almost immediately, bonding over shared interests like hiking and trying out hole-in-the-wall diners. She had this energy about her, like she could light up a room just by walking into it. We started dating and things felt right. Simple but fulfilling. At first, we lived modestly, and it didn't seem to bother her. She never commented on my apartment's mismatched furniture or the fact that we cooked dinner at home more often than we went out. We'd laugh over burnt attempts at new recipes and binge-watch old sitcoms on my slightly outdated TV. I thought she appreciated the life we were building, small but ours. But over time, little things began to surface. It wasn't obvious at first, just subtle comments here and there. Emily would mention a coworker who just got back from a trip to Europe or casually point out how her friend's boyfriend had surprised her with a designer handbag. "Isn't that sweet?" she'd say, her tone light but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off, thinking she was just sharing stories. But the remarks kept coming. Once, after scrolling through her phone, she sighed and said, "You know, Lisa's fiancé rented a cabin in Aspen for their anniversary. How romantic is that?" I nodded, trying to match her enthusiasm, but deep down, I started to wonder if she was comparing our life to theirs. Still, I didn't think much of it at the time. Emily had never struck me as materialistic, and I figured everyone admired things they didn't have. We were happy, or so I thought. We had what we needed for a simple, content life. I didn't think she cared about the things we lacked. But as the months went on, the hints grew less subtle. She'd point out luxury items in storefronts when we walked downtown or linger a little too long over Instagram posts of influencers flaunting their glamorous lives. Once, she half-joked, "If only you had a trust fund hidden somewhere, we could live like that." I laughed it off, pretending not to notice the way her eyes lingered on me afterward, as if waiting for a reaction. I told myself it was harmless, just daydreaming. But a small part of me started to worry. Was she really okay with the life we were building? Or was there a growing void I hadn't noticed? Our conversations began to shift. What used to be playful banter about weekend plans or the latest Netflix show turned into questions about the future. "Do you think you'll ever get promoted soon?" she asked one night, casually stirring her tea. "Not that it matters," she added quickly, but the question hung in the air like a cloud. I reassured her the best I could, talking about my career goals and the steps I was taking to climb the ladder. I believed in hard work and perseverance, and I thought she did too. But looking back, I realized she wasn't asking about my dreams. She was measuring how far I could take her. It wasn't that I didn't want to give Emily the world. I loved her and wanted her to be happy. But I also believed in the life we were building together, even if it wasn't drenched in luxury. I thought she shared that vision. I thought she believed in me. I was wrong. Everything came to a head when Apple announced their latest iPhone. It's strange how something so trivial, a gadget really, could be the spark that ignited a wildfire. The phone was everywhere. Billboards, ads, coworkers showing it off. And one evening, as we sat down for dinner, Emily brought it up. "I need that phone," she said. Her tone casual but with a glimmer in her eye that told me this wasn't just a passing thought. "You know how much I've wanted it, right?" I looked up from my plate, surprised. "The iPhone? I thought the one you have is working fine." "It is," she replied, swirling her fork in her pasta. "But it's not this one. This one has that incredible camera and the sleek design. Everyone's talking about it. It's perfect." I leaned back in my chair, running a hand through my hair. "It looks great, sure. But have you seen the price tag? Over $1,000. It's not exactly something I can afford right now." Her face fell, and for a moment, I thought she'd let it go. But then her lips tightened, and she put her fork down, staring at me across the table. "It's not about the money, you know. It's about effort. It's about priorities." I blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about? You don't try hard enough," she snapped, her voice rising. "You're always going on about saving and budgets. But what about making sure we have the things we want? The things I want? It's like you're fine with settling for less." Her words hit me like a punch. I'd been working long hours, scrimping and saving, trying to build a future for us without relying on my father's wealth. And now, here she was, accusing me of not trying? "Emily," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice calm, "this isn't about me not trying. It's about living within our means. I'm not saying you can't have the phone, just not right now. Maybe in a few months when we've saved up." But she wasn't listening. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked to the window, arms crossed. "You don't get it," she muttered. "You'll never get it." That night, she went to bed early, and I stayed up on the couch, staring at the ceiling. A sinking feeling settled in my chest. I told myself it was just an argument, that we'd talk it out in the morning. But something about the way she'd looked at me, disappointed, almost disgusted, made me feel like I was losing her. The next day started like any other. I went to work, trying to shake off the tension from the night before. I told myself I'd buy her flowers on the way home, maybe even take her out for dinner. Anything to make things right. But when I got home that evening, everything changed. The apartment was unusually quiet as I opened the door. Emily's shoes were by the entrance, her purse on the counter. I figured she was in the bedroom, maybe napping or scrolling through her phone. I set my bag down, loosened my tie, and headed toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and froze. There, on our bed, was Emily with another man. They were tangled together, sheets barely covering them, their laughter cutting through the air like a blade. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, that my mind was playing some cruel trick on me. But it was real. Too real. Emily looked up, her face flushing. Not with guilt, but with annoyance. She pulled the sheet around herself lazily, as if I'd interrupted a casual conversation. "Oh," she said flatly. "You're home early." I couldn't speak. My legs felt like lead, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The man beside her smirked, leaning back against the pillows as if he owned the place. "Who's this?" he asked casually, his voice dripping with arrogance. Emily didn't even flinch. "This is my boyfriend," she said, almost as an afterthought. "Or he was." The man chuckled. "Nice to meet you," he said, his tone mocking. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "Emily," I finally managed, my voice barely a whisper. What is this?" She rolled her eyes, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Look, I didn't want you to find out like this," she said, sitting up. "But honestly, it's for the best. You'll never be able to give me what I deserve. And he can." Her words cut deeper than any knife. I stared at her, searching for any sign of remorse, of regret. But there was nothing. Just cold indifference. The man beside her grinned, clearly enjoying the scene. I turned and walked out, my mind racing. My body felt numb, my chest hollow. By the time I reached the living room, I realized I was shaking. I grabbed my keys, stumbled out the door, and kept walking until I couldn't feel my legs. How had it come to this? How had the woman I loved, the one I thought I'd spend my life with, betrayed me so completely? Every laugh we'd shared, every memory we'd made. It all felt like a cruel joke now. I replayed her words in my head, each one slicing deeper than the last. "You'll never be able to give me what I deserve." For hours, I wandered aimlessly, my mind spiraling. I felt like a failure, like I hadn't just lost Emily, but a part of myself. And yet, beneath the heartbreak, anger began to simmer. Not just at her, but at myself, for not seeing the signs, for believing in her sincerity. That night, as I sat alone on a park bench, staring at the city lights, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of raw emotion, grief, anger, and something I could only describe as numbness. I stayed away from the apartment as much as I could, crashing on a friend's couch while I figured out my next move. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Emily's cold indifference, the smug look on that man's face as if he'd won some twisted game. The betrayal played on a loop in my mind, each memory sharper than the last. I'd always prided myself on handling things on my own. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat, and I wasn't ready to do that. But this time I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. The humiliation burned too deeply, and the betrayal felt too big for me to shoulder alone. So, after days of wrestling with my pride, I made the call I never thought I'd make. My father picked up on the first ring. "Son," he said, his voice warm but slightly cautious. We didn't talk often, not because we were estranged, but because I'd deliberately kept my distance. I'd wanted to prove I didn't need his money or his connections, and he'd respected that. "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have time to talk? It's important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Of course," he said finally. "Come by the house. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." When I arrived at the family estate, a sprawling mansion tucked behind tall gates, I felt a pang of the old resentment. This place represented everything I'd tried to leave behind. The wealth, the privilege, the expectations. But today it didn't feel stifling. Today it felt like sanctuary. My father greeted me in his study, a grand room lined with bookshelves and filled with the faint scent of leather and aged whiskey. He was sitting in his usual chair, a glass of scotch in hand, and his piercing eyes studied me as I walked in. "What's on your mind, son?" he asked, gesturing for me to sit. For a moment I didn't know where to start. How do you explain to someone that your entire life just imploded? But when I finally began to speak, the words poured out in a flood. I told him everything, about Emily, her betrayal, and the smug man she'd chosen over me. I didn't hold back, laying bare every raw detail. When I finished, my father leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He swirled his scotch thoughtfully before speaking. "I never liked the sound of her," he said bluntly. "But I kept my opinions to myself because I respected your choice." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't need advice, Dad. I need help." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Help with what?" I hesitated for a moment, then met his gaze. "That man, the one she cheated with, he thinks he's untouchable. I want to prove him wrong." A slow smile spread across my father's face, the kind that sent chills down the spines of his competitors. "Now we're talking," he said, setting his glass down. "Tell me everything you know about him." Over the next few hours, we pieced together a plan. My father's network was vast. his influence reaching into places I couldn't even begin to imagine. It turned out the man, Marcus, as we discovered, was a wealthy entrepreneur, running a chain of upscale gyms. On the surface, his business seemed legitimate, but my father's team quickly unearthed the cracks in the foundation. Questionable loans, shady partnerships, and a history of skirting regulations. People like Marcus build their empires on sand, my father said, reviewing the dossier his team had compiled. All it takes is one good push, and push we did. First, we exposed his dubious financial dealings. My father called in a favor with a well-placed contact at a prominent bank, and suddenly, Marcus found his accounts under scrutiny. Loan payments were called in, and creditors started circling like vultures. Next, we turned our attention to his business practices. A carefully timed leak to the media revealed safety violations at several of his gym locations. Inspection teams swooped in, slapping fines and shutting down branches temporarily. Customers began demanding refunds, and Marcus's reputation took a nosedive. Finally, we went after his partnerships. My father's legal team sent discreet warnings to some of Marcus's key investors, hinting at the brewing scandals. Within days, they began pulling their support, leaving Marcus scrambling to stay afloat. It wasn't long before the dominoes fell. Marcus's company declared bankruptcy within 3 months. The man who'd once smirked at me from my own bed was now reduced to selling off assets to cover his debts. His name became a cautionary tale in business circles, a man who'd flown too close to the sun. I didn't celebrate when I heard the news. There was no satisfaction in seeing Marcus fall, only a quiet sense of closure. The betrayal still stung, but now it felt like the scales had balanced, if only slightly. One evening, as I sat with my father in his study, he poured us both a drink. "You did well, son," he said, raising his glass. "You took the hit, but you stood back up. That's what matters." I clinked my glass against his, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time in weeks, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. Months passed, and life slowly began to feel normal again, or at least as close to normal as it could get after the chaos Emily had unleashed. I threw myself into work, leaned on friends, and started to rebuild. Therapy helped too, giving me space to process everything and piece myself back together. I was no longer the man who had been blindsided and broken. I was stronger, sharper, and ready to move forward. Marcus's downfall was the talk of the town for weeks. His once thriving business empire had crumbled, leaving him with nothing but debts and shattered pride. I heard rumors of how he was struggling to find work, how his reputation had become a cautionary tale in business circles. Some might have called it poetic justice, but for me, it was simply the consequence of his arrogance. Emily, on the other hand, had disappeared from my life entirely, or so I thought, until the day she came back. It was late on a Friday evening when I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I just finished dinner and was enjoying a quiet moment with a book when the sound startled me. Setting my glass of water down, I walked to the door and opened it. And there she was. Emily stood on the threshold, her once perfect composure replaced by something fragile and raw. Her hair was unkempt, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She clutched a small handbag, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. It took me a moment to register that this disheveled, teary woman was the same person who had once looked at me with disdain, who had thrown away everything we'd built together. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" I didn't move, leaning against the doorframe instead. "What are you doing here, Emily?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked down, as if rehearsing what she was about to say. "I was wrong," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I was so wrong. I made a terrible mistake." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch between us. She took a shaky breath and continued. "I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know your family was, well, who they are. I had no idea how much you were capable of. If I had known." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Stop," I said, my tone calm but firm. "You didn't know because I didn't want you to know. I wanted you to love me for who I am, Not for what I have. She blinked, her tears spilling over. And I did. I swear I did. But I got caught up. I was stupid. Okay? I thought I deserved more, but I didn't realize what I was throwing away. I crossed my arms, studying her. And now you're here because what? Marcus lost everything? You think you can just walk back into my life like nothing happened? Her face crumpled, and she shook her head. No, it's not like that. I've been miserable without you. I've been thinking about everything I gave up, everything we had. I was blinded by stupid, shallow things, and Emily, I said, my voice steady but cold. You made your choice. You chose money, luxury, and a man who promised you the world. You didn't care about the person standing by your side. You only cared about what I could give you. Her tears flowed freely now, and she reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Please, she whispered. We can start over. I'll be better this time. I swear. I shook my head, a bitter smile tugging at my lips. You don't get it, do you? You left me because you thought I couldn't give you what you deserved. But what you never realized is that I've always had the money, the power, the connections. I just didn't think those things should define us. You didn't choose wrong because I wasn't enough. You chose wrong because you couldn't see what really mattered. Her sobs grew louder, and she covered her face with her hands. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe, but it was fleeting. I'd spent too many nights crying over her. Too many days feeling like I wasn't enough. That chapter of my life was closed. I'm sorry, Emily, I said, my voice soft but resolute. But you can't undo what's been done. You made your bed. Now you have to lie in it. She looked up at me, her face a mask of despair. So that's it? She asked, her voice breaking. You're just going to let me walk away? I nodded. Yes, because there's nothing left for you here. Without another word, I stepped back inside and closed the door. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading away, until there was nothing but silence. Emily never came back after that. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved away, trying to start fresh somewhere else. As for me, life moved forward. I continued to work hard, build my own success, and heal from the wounds she'd left behind. In the end, Emily got exactly what she deserved. Nothing. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.